The memory of her father was the warmest thing she owned. It was a thick, cozy blanket she could wrap around herself on the coldest nights. He wasn't a rich man, her dad. He worked as a mechanic, fixing cars in a small, greasy garage that always smelled of oil and gasoline. His hands, even after the most thorough scrub with the rough orange soap, always had a few stubborn black lines under the nails, a permanent tattoo of his hard work. But to the little girl, those hands were magic. They could hold hers and make all the scary shadows in her room disappear. They could fix a wobbly bicycle wheel in minutes. And they could cook the best grilled cheese sandwiches, golden brown and perfectly crispy. Their home wasn't a palace. It was a small apartment where the floorboards creaked a familiar song, and the wallpaper in the hallway was peeling at the corners. But it was filled with laughter and the sound of his voice, deep and steady. Reading her stories at night. He was a quiet man, known in their neighborhood for his honesty. If he said he could fix your car for a certain amount, he would. Even if the job ended up being harder than he thought. He never charged extra. A man's word is his bond, he'd tell her. Though she was too young to understand what it fully meant, she just knew it was important. He was the kind of man who would help a neighbor carry their groceries, or check on an elderly person living alone. He built his life, brick by brick, on being good and doing right. Their life was a simple, gentle rhythm. The girl would go to school, and after, she would sometimes sit on an old crate in the corner of his garage, doing her homework while he worked. The radio would be playing old songs, and the clinking of his tools was the soundtrack to her childhood. She felt safe. She felt loved. The world outside their little bubble could be loud and confusing, but inside their apartment, with the smell of grilled cheese and the sound of his laughter, everything was perfect. The night it all ended didn't feel like a storm coming. There was no warning. It was a regular Tuesday. She was in her pajamas, the soft, flannel ones with little stars on them, and she was brushing her teeth. The minty foam was in her mouth when the knock came. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was hard, fast, and loud, a sound that didn't belong in their quiet evening. Her father's face changed. The easy, relaxed look he wore at home vanished, replaced by a tightness around his eyes. He told her to stay in the bathroom, but she peeked out, her small heart suddenly beating a frantic drum against her ribs. When he opened the door, the hallway was full of large men in uniform. Their presence was so big it seemed to suck all the air out of their small home. Their voices were low and serious, saying words she didn't fully understand. Warrant, robbery, suspect. She saw her father listen, his shoulders straight. He nodded slowly. He was calm, but she could see the muscle in his jaw working. One of the officers stepped forward and took her father's hands, turning them around. The little girl watched, confused, as the metal clicked. She didn't understand what was happening. Why were they putting those shiny bracelets on her daddy's magic hands? Those hands that made her sandwiches and fixed her toys. He looked over at her, his eyes finding hers in the crack of the bathroom door. He gave her a small, sad smile. It was a smile that tried to say, "It's okay. Don't be scared." But she was terrified. "It's going to be all right, sweetheart," he said, his voice steady. But she could hear the strain underneath. "I love you. Be a good girl." Then they led him away. He didn't fight. He just walked, his head held high, through the door and down the stairs. She ran to the window, pressing her small hands and face against the cool glass. She watched as they put him in the back of a car with flashing lights that painted the whole street in red and blue. The neighbors were coming out of their homes, watching. She felt a hot shame wash over her, mixed with a fear so deep it made her stomach hurt. The car drove away, taking the center of her universe with it. The silence it left behind was the loudest, most frightening sound she had ever heard. The cozy apartment suddenly felt huge and empty and cold. Her world, the one built on grilled cheese and steady hands and laughter, had just been shattered into a million pieces. What followed was a blur of gray days. She was taken to a foster home, a place with other children who also had sad eyes and quiet stories. The people there were not unkind, but it wasn't her home. It wasn't her dad. She felt like a ghost, moving through rooms that didn't belong to her. Then came the trial. She was too young to go into the courtroom for most of it, but she was allowed in for the final day. The room was huge and smelled like old wood and cleaning supplies. Everyone spoke in low, serious voices. She saw her father sitting at a table, wearing a suit that didn't look like his. He looked smaller somehow. A man at another table talked about a robbery that had happened at a convenience store. He talked about a man with a gun. He said a witness had pointed to her father. Her father's lawyer, a man who seemed tired and talked too fast, tried to argue. But his words didn't seem to have any power. They felt like little pebbles being thrown against a giant wall. And then there was the judge. He sat up high in a big chair, like a king on a throne. He was an older man with a stern face and cold eyes that looked like they had never seen anything good in the world. He didn't look at her father like he was a person. He looked at him like he was a problem to be solved. When it was time, the judge picked up a small wooden hammer. He spoke in a voice that was flat and final. He said her father was guilty. He said the words 15 years in a state penitentiary. Crack. The sound of that hammer hitting the wood echoed through the silent courtroom. It was a sharp, terrible sound that seemed to slam a door shut forever. For the little girl, it wasn't just a sound. It was the sound of a lock turning on a cage, trapping her father inside. It was the sound of her own childhood ending. She looked at the judge's unmoving, stern face, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that a terrible, terrible mistake had just been made, and no one in this powerful room cared enough to fix it. Just the grayness of the world after her father was taken away was the first thing she noticed. It was as if all the color had been drained out of everything. The sky was never truly blue again. The grass wasn't as green, and food, no matter what it was, tasted like dust. She moved through her days in the foster home like a little ghost, quiet and unseen. She did her chores. She went to school. She answered when spoken to. But the bright, curious light inside her had been snuffed out. Her heart felt like a heavy, cold stone in her chest. At night, she would lie in a bed that wasn't hers, in a room she shared with 2 other girls, and she would wrap that old, warm blanket of her father's memory around herself. She would picture his face, his smile, the sound of his voice reading her a story. But now, those happy memories were also painful. They were a reminder of everything she had lost. For a long time, she was just sad. A deep, bottomless sadness that made her want to curl up in a ball and disappear. But slowly, as the months turned into a year, that sadness began to change. It started to heat up, to bubble and simmer inside her until it turned into something else, a fierce, burning anger. It wasn't a loud, screaming anger. It was a quiet, stubborn one. She wasn't angry at her father. She was angry at the system, at the police, at the tired lawyer, and most of all, at the judge. The judge with the cold eyes and the final, crushing hammer. He was the one who had the power. He was the one who had listened to the lies and the mistakes, and had decided to break her family apart. In her mind, he became the villain of her story. Then, one ordinary afternoon, she saw his face on the television in the common room of the foster home. The news was on. A reporter was speaking in a serious tone, and there was a picture of the judge on the screen. The little girl, now a teenager, froze where she stood. A dish she was drying almost slipping from her hand. The reporter said the judge had been in a terrible car accident. His car had skidded off a wet road and hit a tree. The injuries were very bad, they said. A spinal injury. The doctors were not sure if he would ever walk again. The other kids in the room barely glanced at the screen. It was just another boring news story to them. But for her, the world stopped. She stared at the judge's photo, a formal picture of him in his black robes, looking powerful and untouchable. And now, he was broken. A strange feeling washed over her. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't exactly sadness either. It was a sense of balance. The universe had taken her father's freedom, and now it had taken the judge's ability to walk. People might have expected her to feel glad, but she didn't. She just felt a cold, hard certainty. This was not a coincidence. This was a sign. It was as if a door she never knew existed had just cracked open, letting in a single, sharp sliver of light. That night, instead of crying herself to sleep, she started to think. Really think. The judge had all the power of the law, but it hadn't found the truth. The law had failed. Now, the judge's own body had failed him. He was a prisoner, just like her father, only his prison was made of flesh and bone, not concrete and steel. A wild, impossible idea began to form in her mind. It was so crazy that at first, she tried to push it away. But it kept coming back, growing stronger and more detailed. What if she could fix what was broken? Not just one thing, but both. The law had locked her father away, and medicine, it seemed, had given up on the judge. What if she could find a key where no one else was looking? The very next day, she went to the public library after school. It was a big, old building that smelled of paper and quiet. Before, she had only gone to the children's section. Now, she walked purposefully towards the adult sections. She found the law books first. Huge, heavy books with titles she could barely understand. She pulled one down, the weight of it surprising her. She opened it, and the text was dense and confusing, full of words she had never seen before. She felt a flicker of defeat. How could she, a poor foster kid, ever understand this? But then she thought of her father's face. She closed the law book. Maybe that wasn't the way. Not yet. She moved to another section, medicine. She found books on the human body, on the nervous system, on the spine. She learned what a spinal cord injury was. She read about paralysis, the books, and the serious face doctors quoted in them. So that severe damage was often permanent, that the chances of recovery were very, very small. Most people would have given up right there. But the teenager was not most people. She had a fire inside her now. If the regular, well-known path said no, then she would have to find a different path. A path the important people and the expensive doctors had missed. She started reading everything she could find about recovery. Not just the mainstream medical journals, but also stories from other countries, studies on new therapies, articles about the brain's amazing ability to heal itself, a concept called neuroplasticity. She read about physical therapies that involved specific, repetitive movements to retrain the nervous system. She read about electrical stimulation, about water therapy, about mental exercises. She filled notebooks with her messy handwriting. She drew diagrams of the spine. She didn't understand everything, not at first. The scientific language was a wall. But she was stubborn. She would read a single paragraph over and over again, 10 times, 20 times, until the meaning started to break through. She used a dictionary until the pages became soft and worn. She was teaching herself a new language, the language of healing, one difficult word at a time. Her foster parents thought she was just studying very hard for school. Her teachers saw a quiet girl who had suddenly become intensely focused. They didn't know that her homework was just a cover. Her real work began when she got to the library. This was her mission. This was her purpose. She wasn't a doctor. She knew that. She was just a girl with a notebook and a desperate hope. But she began to see connections that others might have missed. She pieced together bits of information from different studies, from different parts of the world, creating a complete picture of a therapy plan in her mind. It was unconventional. It was a long shot, but it was detailed. It was specific, and it was all for the man who had destroyed her life. That was the hardest part. The anger was still there, a hot coal in her stomach, but it was now buried under layers of research and a cold, clear strategy. She wasn't doing this for him. She was doing this for her dad. The judge was just a tool. He was the lock, and she was slowly, painstakingly forging a key. She would cure the judge, and in return, he would have to free her father. It was a simple trade, an impossible, crazy, simple trade. She held on to this idea for years, through the rest of her time in school. As she grew from a teenager into a young woman, the quiet, sad girl was gone. In her place was someone with a fierce, unbreakable goal shining in her eyes. She was ready. The plan was set. Now, all she needed was a chance to speak. The young woman stood outside the courthouse, and it felt like standing at the foot of a giant. The building was made of huge, gray stones that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. Its tall columns and heavy doors were meant to make people feel small and unimportant. And for a moment, she did feel small. The bag on her shoulder, which held her precious notebooks, felt suddenly flimsy and foolish. Who was she to walk into this place of power with a plan made of paper and hope? She took a deep breath, the air cool and sharp in her lungs. She thought of her father. She pictured his face not as it was the day they took him away, sad and strained, but as it was in the garage, smiling, a smudge of oil on his cheek. That memory was her fuel. It straightened her spine and lifted her chin. She walked up the wide stone steps, her heart hammering a rhythm of fear and determination against her ribs. Inside, the air was stale and silent, like a held breath. The hallway was vast, with a high ceiling that made every footstep echo. People in sharp, expensive suits walked quickly, their faces serious, carrying thick folders. They glanced at her, a young woman in simple, clean clothes, and their eyes slid away, uninterested. She was nobody to them. She found the right courtroom. The door was heavy wood, and pushing it open felt like moving a mountain. The room was just as she remembered from her childhood, but somehow colder and more imposing. The same smell of old wood and floor polish. The same hushed, serious atmosphere. And there, high up on his bench, was the judge. Time had not been kind to him. The stern face she remembered was now etched with deep lines of pain and bitterness. He sat in a large, motorized wheelchair, a thick blanket covering his legs. His shoulders were hunched and his hands, resting on the arms of the chair, were clenched into tight fists. His eyes, which she remembered as being cold, now held a deep, tired anger. He was a king, but his throne was a prison of metal and wheels. He looked like a man who had not smiled in a very, very long time. She found a seat at the back, her hands trembling slightly. She watched as the proceedings began. This was a hearing for her father's case, a chance for new evidence to be reviewed. The lawyer representing her father, a young public defender who had been assigned the file only a week before, stood up. He spoke quickly, his words tumbling out in a dry, legal monotone. He mentioned a misplaced evidence log, a witness who had since recanted their story. But he presented it all like he was reading from a grocery list. There was no fire in his words, no passion. It was clear he believed this was a hopeless task, a box he had to check before moving on to the next case. The judge listened, his expression not changing. He occasionally looked down at some papers, his mouth a thin, unimpressed line. The young woman's heart sank. This was it. This was the system failing her father all over again. The lawyer finished with a weak, "Therefore, we request a review," and sat down, already gathering his things as if the outcome was decided. The judge opened his mouth, likely to dismiss the whole thing. This was the moment. It was now or never. Before she could lose her nerve, she stood up. The wooden bench creaked loudly in the silent room. Every head turned to look at her. The public defender looked surprised, then annoyed. The bailiff, a large man standing near the front, took a step forward, his hand going to his belt. "Your Honor." Her voice came out as a squeak. She cleared her throat, forcing strength into it. "Your Honor, may I speak?" The judge's cold eyes focused on her. He looked irritated by the interruption. "This is a court of law, young lady. You do not just speak. Who are you?" She swallowed hard. "I am his daughter," she said, her voice growing steadier. She pointed towards the empty chair where her father should have been sitting. "My father is an innocent man. The evidence was wrong. The witness was wrong. Everyone was wrong." A few people in the room shifted uncomfortably. Someone let out a low, disbelieving chuckle. The judge's expression did not change. "That is what this hearing was for," he said, his voice dripping with boredom. "Your lawyer has spoken. The matter is concluded." He was about to turn away, to pick up his gavel and bring it down. Just like before, panic shot through her. She had to say it. She had to say the crazy thing. "But I can prove it," she blurted out. And I can help you." The chuckles in the room grew louder. The bailiff took another step towards her. "That's enough," he said firmly, but the judge raised a hand, stopping the bailiff. He was staring at her now, not with anger, but with a deep, intense curiosity. He had seen many things in his courtroom: anger, tears, lies, but he had never seen this. This was not a legal argument. This was something else entirely. "Help me with what?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "What could you possibly do for me?" This was it. The moment her years of secret work, her lonely nights in the library, all came down to. She took another deep breath, looked directly into his tired, pained eyes, and spoke the words that sounded insane even to her. "I believe I can give you back your legs." For a second, there was absolute silence. Then, the courtroom erupted. It wasn't a loud roar, but a wave of disbelieving laughter and shocked whispers. People looked at each other, shaking their heads. The public defender put his head in his hands. She heard someone mutter, "The girl's lost her mind." Her face burned with humiliation, but she didn't look away from the judge. She held his gaze, her own eyes pleading and desperate, but also filled with a strange, unwavering certainty. The judge did not laugh. He did not smile. The laughter around him died down as people saw his serious expression. He was a man of facts and logic, a man who believed only in what he could see and touch. But he was also a man who lived in constant pain, a man who had been told by the best doctors that his situation was hopeless. He had nothing left to lose. He studied her face. He saw the desperation, yes, but he also saw something that reminded him of himself long ago, a stubborn, unbreakable will. He saw a fire that had not been extinguished by hardship. In his world of gray pain, her crazy offer was a spark of color. He leaned forward slightly, the motor of his wheelchair whirring softly. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "Explain yourself," he commanded. "And it had better be good." The judge's chambers were a world apart from the noisy courtroom. Here, the silence was deep and thick. Bookshelves stretched from the floor to the ceiling, packed with heavy law books that looked like they had never been opened. A large, dark wooden desk stood in the middle of the room, its surface perfectly clean except for a single pen and a writing pad. It was a room that felt powerful, but also lonely. The young woman stood nervously in front of the big desk, while the judge maneuvered his wheelchair behind it. He didn't offer her a seat, so he began, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "You have my attention. Now, tell me why I should not have you removed from this building for wasting the court's time." His words were harsh, but his eyes held a different message. They were curious. He was a man who had run out of options, and when you have no options left, even the craziest idea starts to look interesting. The young woman took a shaky breath. This was her only chance. She had to make him understand. "Your Honor," she started, her voice softer than she wanted. "I know I am not a doctor. I have no degrees. I am just a girl who loves her father. She paused, gathering her courage. But for years, while my father has been in a prison of concrete, I have been studying. I have been reading everything I could find about the spine, about nerves, about how the body can heal itself. She reached into her bag and pulled out her notebooks. They were not fancy. They were the cheap, spiral-bound kind you buy at the supermarket. But they were filled, cover to cover, with her neat, careful handwriting. There were diagrams of the human spine, notes on medical studies, and lists of exercises. She placed them gently on the edge of his giant desk. The doctors told you it was permanent, didn't they? She said, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. They said you would never walk again. The judge's jaw tightened. He gave a single, slow nod. The memory of those conversations was clearly a fresh wound. I read those studies too. She continued, the famous ones. But then I looked further. I found research from other countries. Studies on something called neuroplasticity. It means the brain can relearn how to do things. How to send signals down paths everyone thought were broken. It's not magic. It's science that nobody here is talking about yet. She opened one of the notebooks to a page filled with a detailed daily schedule. I have put together a plan. It is a combination of very specific, repetitive movements. It starts small, just trying to activate the muscles in your feet, even if you can't feel them. Then it moves to your legs. There is water therapy, to take the weight off. There are mental exercises, where you just close your eyes and picture yourself moving your toes, your ankles, your knees. You have to make your brain believe it is possible again. She looked at him, her eyes blazing with a sincerity that was impossible to fake. I am not saying it will be easy. It will be the hardest work you have ever done. It will be painful. It will be frustrating. And I cannot promise you it will work 100%. But I can promise you that I have a plan that has a chance. A real chance. And your doctors have given you none. The judge was silent for a long time. He looked from her face to the worn notebooks and back again. He was a man who dealt in proof and evidence. This was not proof. This was a desperate gamble. But the evidence he had been given by his doctors was a life sentence, just like the one he had given her father. And in return for this chance, he finally asked, his voice quiet. In return, she said, her heart pounding, you give my father a real chance. You agreed to look at his case again. Not just a 5-minute hearing. A real, deep look. You use your power, your knowledge of the law, to find the truth. You find the evidence that was missed. You talk to the witness who changed their story. You give me your word that you will not stop until you know, for sure, if he is guilty or innocent. She leaned forward slightly, her hands gripping the strap of her bag. It is a trade. I will work to free you from your prison, and you will work to free my father from his. The room was so quiet she could hear the old clock on the wall ticking. The judge looked down at his own hands, resting uselessly on the arms of his wheelchair. He thought about the endless, gray future that stretched out before him. A future of being helped in and out of bed, of ramps and elevators, of people looking at him with pity. He thought about the fiery, determined young woman standing in front of him, who had built a key out of paper and hope. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He saw no trickery there, only a raw, honest determination that mirrored his own will to live. All right, he said, the words simple and final. We have a deal. And so, the most unlikely partnership began. The next day, the young woman arrived at the judge's large, quiet house. It was filled with expensive things, but it felt as empty and cold as his chambers. She started her work immediately. The first few sessions were brutal. The judge was a terrible patient. He was angry, impatient, and quick to dismiss her methods. When she asked him to simply try and visualize moving his big toe, he scoffed. This is foolishness. He would snap, but she did not back down. She was not afraid of his temper. She had faced worse. She spoke to him with a quiet firmness. Your Honor, you gave me your word. This is part of the work. Now, please, close your eyes and try. Slowly, grudgingly, he began to cooperate. She would spend hours each day, carefully moving his legs through the motions she had mapped out in her notebooks. She would have him sit in his pool, the water making his body light, and guide his limbs through exercises that were impossible on land. She worked his muscles with her hands, talking to him softly about the studies she had read, explaining the science behind every tiny movement. And in the evenings, after she had left, the judge would sit in his study. The law books were open again, but this time, they were for a different case. He pored over the old files from her father's trial. He read the original police report, noticing the sloppy handwriting and the missing details. He found the statement from the witness who had later said the police had pressured her. He saw the photograph of the stolen item, a simple watch. and noted that the serial number had never been checked against the one her father supposedly owned. He started making phone calls. He used his authority, his reputation, to get answers. He tracked down the original police officers, who were now retired and less careful with their words. He found the store owner, who admitted the security camera footage was too blurry to clearly see the robber's face. Weeks turned into months. In the judge's body, something tiny began to happen. One afternoon, as the young woman was guiding his foot through emotion, she felt it. A flicker. A tiny, almost invisible twitch in his ankle. She froze. "Your Honor," she whispered. "Did you feel that? Did you do that?" The judge's eyes were wide with shock. He had felt it. A faint, electric spark. A message from his brain that had finally, after years of silence, gotten through. "It was nothing," he said, trying to sound dismissive, but his voice was trembling. A muscle spasm. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. It was the first crack in the wall. From that day on, the dynamic between them changed. The judge's angry resistance melted away, replaced by a fierce, focused determination. He no longer did the exercises for her, or because of their deal. He did them for himself. He started working late into the night, both on his physical therapy and on her father's case. The two tasks had become intertwined in his mind. Both were about fixing a broken system. Both were about finding the truth that was hidden beneath the surface. The stern, cold judge was gone. In his place was a man fighting for his life, and in the process, he had started to remember what justice truly meant. The morning of the hearing felt different. There was a charge in the air, a feeling that something long dormant was about to wake up. The young woman helped the judge get ready, her hands steady as she adjusted his suit jacket. They didn't speak much. There was no need for words. The months of shared struggle had created a silent language between them. He looked at her, and his eyes, once so cold, now held a complex mix of gratitude, respect, and a deep, simmering anger at the injustice they were about to confront. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread through the legal community like wildfire. The stern judge who never showed mercy was reopening an old, forgotten case. Reporters were in the back, their cameras ready. The air was thick with whispers and anticipation. The young woman took her seat in the front row, directly behind the table where her father would sit. Her heart was not just beating fast. It felt like a wild bird trying to escape its cage. This was it. The end of the long, hard road. The door near the judge's bench opened, and a guard led her father in. She almost didn't recognize him. The years in prison had carved deep lines into his face and turned his hair gray. His shoulders, once so strong and proud, were slightly hunched. He walked slowly, his eyes downcast, as if he had learned to make himself small. He looked like a man who had given up all hope. Then he looked up. His eyes scanned the crowd, and they found hers. For a second, he just stared, as if he was seeing a ghost. Then a light, a tiny, fragile spark, flickered in the depths of his tired eyes. It was the first time she had seen that light in over a decade. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She gave him a small, trembling smile, and he nodded back. A world of love and questions in that simple gesture. The bailiff called the court to order, and all eyes turned to the judge. He maneuvered his wheelchair to the center of the bench. He looked older, but also stronger. The pain was still there in the lines around his mouth, but it was now mixed with a new, unshakable strength. He did not speak right away. He let the silence hang in the room, heavy and full of meaning. He looked at the young woman's father, really looked at him, not as a case number, but as a man. This court, the judge began, his voice clear and powerful, echoing in the silent room, is built on a single principle, the pursuit of truth. Sometimes, in our rush, in our reliance on procedures and assumptions, we fail in that pursuit. We fail the people who depend on us. He picked up a file from his desk. It was thick, filled with the notes he had taken over the months. The case against this man, the judge continued, was built on sand. The primary witness has submitted a sworn statement that her identification was coerced. The police officer in charge of the evidence log admitted, under oath, that a key piece of documentation was misplaced. The stolen watch, the central item in this robbery, was never matched by its serial number to any property owned by the accused. With every sentence, the young woman felt a weight lifting from her soul. She watched her father's face. The confusion there was slowly being replaced by a dawning, disbelieving hope. He was sitting up straighter, listening to every word. The original investigation was flawed. The judge declared, his voice growing sharper. The defense provided at the trial was inadequate. The truth was buried under laziness and haste. And he paused, and for a moment, his eyes met the young woman's. I failed to see it. I wielded the power of this court without the necessary care. For that, I am deeply sorry. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. A judge admitting he was wrong was almost unheard of. Based on the overwhelming new evidence of a miscarriage of justice, the judge said, his voice rising to a final, thunderous conclusion. The original conviction is hereby overturned. The charges are dismissed. This man is innocent, and he is to be released from custody immediately. His record is to be cleared. Crack. The sound of the gavel was the same as it had been all those years ago. But this time, it was not a sound of an ending. It was a sound of a beginning. It was the sound of a lock being broken. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then, the room erupted. The young woman didn't hear the cheers or the reporters shouting. She only saw her father. He had buried his face in his hands, his whole body shaking with silent, relief sob tears. The guard was unlocking the cuffs from his wrist. The sound of that metal click was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She rushed forward as he stood up, stumbling slightly on legs and used to freedom. They fell into each other's arms, holding on so tightly it felt like they would never let go. He smelled different, of prison soap and stale air, but his embrace was the same. It was the safe, warm harbor she had been lost without for so long. He was whispering her name over and over into her hair, his voice choked with emotion. Over her father's shoulder, she looked at the judge. He was watching them, and for the first time, she saw a real, genuine smile touch his lips. It transformed his entire face. He looked at P. And then he did something that made the entire courtroom fall silent once more. He placed both hands firmly on the arms of his wheelchair. He took a deep, slow breath. With a grunt of immense effort, he pushed. His arms trembled with the strain. His face was tight with concentration. For a terrifying second, it seemed he would fall, but he didn't. He pushed himself up, his body swaying, and he stood. It was only for a moment. It was a shaky, unsteady, monumental moment. He wasn't walking, but he was standing on his own feet. He was free from the chair. He looked at the young woman, his eyes shining with a truth more powerful than any law. He had given her father his freedom, and she, with her stubborn hope and her dogged determination, had given him back his dot. He slowly lowered himself back into the chair. Exhausted but triumphant, the young woman held her father, feeling the solid, real weight of him. The journey had been long and hard, paved with tears and loneliness. But as they stood there, surrounded by the stunned silence of the courtroom, she knew that love had done what the law could not. It had built a bridge over an impossible gap, and it had brought them both home.